Good morning, grandkids. Today I'm going to read another chapter in the book that I'm writing about Dorkly, the young wizard. This is chapter 8. That night in the palace hall, the king had switched from a family meal to a full-scale dinner party and dance. He had directed the servants to set up many tables, put out place settings, fill the tables with food down the center length of them all. The tables were all placed in the huge courtroom, right and left of the throne, leaving plenty of room before the throne for dancing the night away. All of the palace family, people living on the palace grounds around the court, and outside that gateway, which was opened up, and all the people living around the outer court were invited. Many musicians were set up and already playing softly as people were ushered in by many fancy-dressed guards and servants. The king was sitting on his throne, but stepped down and started greeting some of the guests as they arrived. When his daughter arrived, he escorted her to the head table, just below and to the right of the throne, which was the most elegantly decked out table. His table was covered with dark blue cloth, place settings of pale blue glass, gold utensils, and heavy but finely decorated crystal goblets. The king seated his daughter to his right, and then he sat down at the head of the table. King Conley was chatting with Othello and sipping his wine when his two sons arrived and was escorted to the table and seated. Dermis to the king's left, with Dupree beside him. Conley gave them a big smile, asked if they had been enjoying their day. Dupree offered a large smile and told him about the book that he was reading. The king then turned to Dermis. "Have you been up to anything interesting today, son?" King Conley had set down his glass and had clasped his hands together over his waist, but now he turned a bit toward Dermis, removing his hands, but then reaching quickly for his glass of wine. His eyes had widened, but he quickly lowered them back to the table and reached for a sweetened roll as his daughter passed him a platter. He noticed a sly smile on Dupree's face as he just sat there listening and watching. Dermis finally said, "I've mostly been writing today. I have ideas about becoming an author, trying mostly to pull ideas out of my head, taking a few notes, writing out little scenes as they come to me. Quite an interesting endeavor." And he sipped at his drink. "Great, great," Conley said as he rested his elbow on his chair arm, letting his hand hang down casually over the front of his enchanted belt and hiding it. With his other hand, he motioned at the table as he looked at Dupree. "You want to pass me that platter of rolls again, son? The ones full of nuts and cherries look good. I love those things," he exclaimed enthusiastically. He looked back at Dermis. "I used to think about writing when I was young, just never could sit still long enough to really do anything with it. Hope you have better luck than I did," and he chuckled. He looked back over at Othello, starting to say something to her, but saw a couple of men asking her for a dance. She accepted one of them, and they went out on the dance floor, the gentleman swinging her around on the way, her skirts flying prettily around her. The king beamed happily. He looked down the table and realized that Wizard Gorman had been seated at the end, and his young son seated beside him and Othello. His table was full, and everyone seemed happy and was eating or dancing. He gave Gorman a nod, letting him know that he had used the enchantment. The king looked around the room, noticing that things were getting louder and everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. The dance floor was full, and all the pretty ladies swirling around looked like spring flowers tossing in the breeze. He chuckled at that. By this time, the king knew he was starting to feel the couple of glasses of wine he'd had. Ah, the times he and his wife used to have. They had loved dancing. He looked around to see who was left at the few tables that weren't empty by now. Why not, he thought with a grin, and got up and walked over to a nearby table where sat a lovely lady, a fan in one hand and a glass in the other. She had mounds of black hair piled on top of her head, small ringlets undone on her slender neck. She had sparkling gems on her ears and around her neck. Her dress was not bouffant, as was most of the dancers, but was a golden sheath hugging a wonderfully endowed woman. King Conley bowed before this lovely creature, and with a smile he extended his hand and said, "I would be most honored if you would grant me a dance, my lady." She smiled and replied, "It would be my pleasure, my king." "Please call me Conley this night," he said, taking her offered hand, and they danced off into an evening of fun. But as they danced and chatted, he kept an eye on his table and his children. So he much later noticed when Dermis left the dance floor, hurried to the table. There he watched him pick up his glass, swig a drink, and setting it down, take off for the doors. And he left. "I would give a fortune to know where he's off to," was Conley's worried thoughts. After a few more turns around the dance floor, he returned his lady to her seat, and bowing to her, he assured her he had had a lovely time. He saw Gorman standing by their table, drink in hand, watching the dancers. He told him to come and sit down at his end of the table. He knew Dermis wouldn't be back. As Dorman was seating himself, they both looked out over the dance floor and laughed. Young wizard Dorkly had placed his pointy hat on the table, was out on the floor with a lively young girl, his hair flying as he swung his lady around, a big grin on his face. The two men looked at each other. As Gorman said, "Lordy, lordy, do you think he'll ever grow up into a legitimate wizard?" "Well, I think he's coming along okay," the king said. "He made me a pretty good enchantment for my belt," the king said as his smile left his face. "I'm anxious to tell you what I saw when I looked at my son with this enchantment open, but I don't want to chance it out here. If you will stay after the dance, we'll retire to my sitting rooms." The wizard nodded that he understood and said, "I found out a little bit. Maybe not like what you have. Not anything good, I'm afraid. I think we'd both better wait to share what we found out." And Wizard Gorman turned and waved for a server and ordered a fresh glass of more wine. So we shall have to wait and find out what they each have found out. I'm anxious to see how that belt is working for the king, aren't you? So I will see you next time, reading the next chapter of this story about young wizard Dorkly. Bye-bye, grandkids.